This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Body Bags with Joseph Scott Morgan. Believe it or not, I'm actually a fan of the band Smashing Pumpkins. People might find that kind of strange. There's something that's surreal about them. It's weird. The way their songs were written. And there's one song in particular that I like, and I think that it has a lot to do with a period of time in my life when I was a kid back in junior high school, on the cusp of going into senior high school. And it's the song 1979. And it kind of evokes memories of freedom and, not really having a care in the world, being a knucklehead, that sort of thing. And I enjoy that song. For some reason, it's kind of put a hook in my brain, and every now and then I'll have to listen to it. And 1979 was an interesting period of time, I think, in our country. We're going through political changes and societal changes and all that, but life carried on. And as always, in homicide cases in particular, families are benchmarked by them. But unfortunately, the world does not stop with you to mourn. It's only us that are left behind that have that memory of the individual that continue to mourn. But, there was a case in 1979 that left a family with few answers. And finally, they have them. They have these answers because of our friends at Othram Labs. Today on Body Bags, we're going to discuss the case and recent identification of Joseph A. Caliva. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. Yeah, memories of 1979, Dave.
I've been sitting here flashing back the entire time. Yep, big time. It was a big year. And when I look back at the 70s decade, there was so much weirdness, crazy that went on. It only makes sense by the end of the decade, disco was actually still a thing, because we were just so shocked from the entire decade. But by the end of the decade, by 79, things had really kind of gotten into a different kind of place, And when I saw this story, my first thought was, can you imagine this in your life? Something from 1979, huge. And you don't have an answer. You don't have an answer for decades, a lifetime,
yeah.
It boggles my mind what some human beings go through in this life. How do they get out of bed?
Not to wax too ethereal here, but, you think of the quote referencing the English, them living lives of quiet desperation. Right. A lot of us do. You sit back and, after everything has kind of settled down, and I've seen this with cases that I've worked over the years, you see the crushing agony, and that's really the only way to describe it with families. You see this crushing agony where they look to you, investigators. They're like, I want answers, and they want something else. They want relief, and unfortunately, there's not within the context of what we can do as humans. There's not too much you can do to give somebody relief. It's one of these things that takes time to work through, and it comes all about with this idea of acceptance, I think. But I don't know that there's never a total acceptance. I love the reference of, getting uh, and understanding as a family there will always be an empty chair, at Thanksgiving and Christmas and all those sorts of things. But can you imagine, with this fellow, he was gone and no one really knew what had become of him.
Mm-hmm.
And when you go back to 79 and how the authorities in the Chicago area had a young man that was out riding his horse and came across probably one of the most horrific things that any human being could visualize. And he was a young man. He was out horseback riding, and he caught sight of these burning remains. And I can't even imagine it for a civilian to come across this, because you're not expecting that. And I don't know, the story itself, kind of tells the tale from there about, it starts off with that benchmark of horror. And of course, it's all confirmed for the family that later on. And the problem is that it took decades, literally decades, to kind of understand the horrific scene that young man discovered on horseback, and what actually happened all those years later.
Joe, when you talk about going back in time, 1979, and we think about what was going on and how old we were, and I think about the victim, I think about the fellow on horseback, and then the police, because even though police are conditioned to see many things, finding something like this is not an everyday occurrence. I don't know how you can prepare yourself for this. So I think about all of those things coming to a head on this August 5th, 1979. And in my head, you know what? It was the summer of 79. I wasn't even driving then. And Donna Summer and the Knack, they were the two biggest songs of the summer of 79. And I'm thinking about the guy on horseback. Is he listening to the radio and hearing Donna Summer's Bad Girls, toot, toot, beep, beep, and then, hey, there's a burning bag. And usually these are in front of my door when somebody knocks late at night.
Right.
And here we are. And it took, from that moment, I figured there's kind of a clock running for the victim, the families, everybody involved. The clock starts right now. How do you move on with life without figuring out exactly what, who, and everything about this right now in this moment? It just seems to me like we have this intelligence, we have this science ability, that there shouldn't be a mystery that lasts for 44 years, Joe, to me. And I know that's really overstating what my thoughts on humanity, I guess, but I just kind of think, well, we put a man on the moon and we can't figure this out. 44 years it takes. That's bonkers.
Yeah, it is. And, for the police department that actually initially worked this case, it was actually out of Barrington Hill, outside of Chicago. This is not something that was a common occurrence. It's kind of back then it was kind of more of a rural area. It wasn't densely populated. I mean, obviously you've got people that are going on horseback rides, and to look over and see what turned out to be a smoldering torso at that point in time. I can't imagine, what you think. First off, as I mentioned, the civilian that discovered the body, and then the police. When you go out there, you're beginning to think, well, who in the world would do anything like this? And it kind of smacks of something, particularly back then, that you look at the body and you think, wow, this is something that you would only see done or perpetrated at the hands of, say, somebody involved in organized crime.
Right.
Because there's an attempt here, because this body, and I'll go ahead and tell you, this body was dismembered, and not just slightly dismembered. There were parts that were missing. And that's what kind of is the driver behind all of this. And you've got things that are scattered essentially to the wind, or they're scattered relative to the whims of those that perpetrated the crime. Either way, you have to have a starting point. And I think the biggest question is, who would come to this location with these remains and do this to them and leave them behind? And of course, the police are asking the same question. Dave, I got to tell you, buddy, homicide cases are difficult enough to work many times. Not always, but many times they are very complex. And you add this additional layer of, first off, dismemberment, because that tells you a lot about the perpetrator. And you add this other element of destruction by fire. It's hard to kind of put everything together and try to deform some kind of story as you move forward. And then we have to keep in mind, and it's really important that we think about 1979. It would be several years, Dave, before Sir Alec Jeffreys actually, introduced this idea of crime fighting through DNA. We're still, years before that happened. So, where did the police go? What do they do? And I think that it's important to understand how all this kind of went down at that point in time.
I was wondering, in looking at this, Joe, a couple of quick questions for you that I think sometimes get overlooked. And that is, when referring to a torso, exactly what are we talking about? Because in here, it's explained hands, head, arms, parts of this body have been cut off. Yeah. And I always thought when we talked about the torso, pretty much the body from the waist up minus the arms and head.
Yeah.
Is that the torso? Or what's the lower torso, I guess, is kind of what my point is, because upper and lower, and I thought it was just this one area.
When we think about a torso, we're talking about the core of the body. The torso does not typically include the head and the arms and the legs. And if a body is transected, when you think about if you in an anatomical environment where you're doing a dissection, you're not thinking about, we're not considering this from a criminal standpoint. We're kind of divided into literally transected across the body. You think about the lower abdomen, and that's kind of the demarcation for the lower torso. You think about the pelvis, and then you have the upper torso is involved with chest, everything up to the base of the neck. So that's kind of how the body is divided up. And you'll hear people in medicine and anatomical sciences when they begin to kind of give you these landmarks. And of course, these people can go into very detailed descriptions. And most of the time, it's not something that those of us that don't indwell that world will never have any use for. Right. But it's got a great utility when we begin to think about landmarks. And then you take that and you put it over into the investigation of crimes. To what lengths did the individual go to? And let's face it, this is literally an attempt to destroy any kind of semblance of what's been left behind as far as getting an ID. And I think that's where the rub comes in this case. And
that's why I had to ask. And for those of you who think that was a really silly question, forgive me. It's just one of those things I've wondered and wanted to ask, and it just never came up because I thought, how can there be an upper and lower? Now I understand. So now as we move forward, on the day this happened, I found it fast. Boy, if you're a family member, I apologize. I don't want you to think that we're looking at this as some kind of grand mystery that's been solved for our entertainment. It's just we've dealt with it now long enough that it becomes more and different than what a family member is going to go through. How do you survive in life when you have a loved one who has been treated in this manner? So starting with August 5th, 1979, Barrington Hills Police Chief Al Should, this is what he explained. He said, I was cutting my lawn at the time when I got the call. Think about how many times we're doing something innocuous, just matter of fact, going through life, and something happens that changes. It's a marker in our life for the rest of it. There will be the time before the body was found, before the torso was found, and the time after. And that's why he was able to narrow it down as the police chief. I got a call while I'm mowing the yard. And he says this, Joe, it was chaos right after that. Hard to recognize because it was burned. Chief said he can still remember the smell. And the way the chief explained the body parts being found makes it seem as though they were not found together in one place. The upper torso is found, the lower torso is found, then the legs, the head and hands were never found. Did you know that?
Yes.
They never found the head and hands. The whole area was checked, and they never came up with anything. Even now, head and hands not found. That to me is a shocking moment in time. So here we are again, 1979, Joe, the summer of 79, and they couldn't identify. There wasn't enough. And I'm wondering what kind of condition, what would it look like? The torso of a human being that has been burned, the arms and legs, the head, all those things they're not there. It's just the torso. That's it.
Right. And when you even as a result of fire, you can still make out at a scene, once you get past the ghastly nature of seeing a burned human remain, you can actually make out some anatomical landmarks to let you know, okay, well, this is not just, and forgive me, this is not just a side of beef that's laying here, right, or some other element from some other animal. This is actually a human torso. And that's one of the things that and you have to get past the idea of how charred it is, because beneath the charring might rest answers, to the bigger questions. First off, what brought about the death? And secondly, who are they? And you have to be very careful with these cases when you're working them, not just at the scene, but actually back in the morgue.
Can you even determine if it's human?
Yeah, you can. And again, that goes back to how well you know your anatomy. And, it seems over the top, but when you actually open the torso, there's a distinct organ arrangement that we have within our bodies, and you can appreciate that. But, there's anatomical landmarks that you can look for, even in the face of a fire scene, where you can come to an acceptable conclusion that this was in fact human. In what you're dealing with. And then the big question is, first off, from an investigative standpoint, what happened to this individual to the point where they would be in the state? You look at a body that has had parts removed, that implies that there is a dark action that's going on relative to this individual. There's an attempt to obscure identity here. You know that there's something rather malevolent at work here. And the big thing that's very striking, you talked about how they never recovered the head and the hands. Well, back in 1979, the two primary ways that we would get people identified in the medical legal world, and it still applies today, I think to a bit of a lesser degree because of DNA, has to do with the teeth, where we would do, an examination of the teeth. And because our teeth are all unique, if you have, we have 32 teeth in our head, and each tooth is unique in the way it is positioned in the mouth. They can, teeth can be rotated in a certain direction. They can be pitched. You can have all types of problems with your teeth relative to, say, for instance, cavitated areas have not been treated. You can have cavitated areas that have been treated. You've got amalgams that are sitting in as fillings. You can have caps, crowns, partial dentures. You can see evidence of root canals. That should send a chill up everybody's spine. But all of those little markers are, in fact, unique to an individual. And you take that. The reason the head is so important, the teeth particularly, is because when you take that and just mathematically, you talk about 32 teeth. If you have antemortem x-rays that you can compare this to, and do postmortem X-rays on a head, which we do, and you compare the two dental images, you can come up with an ID pretty quickly. The physical examination that a forensic dentist or forensic odontologist does with the mouth itself, you can look for all these kinds of restorations. And believe it or not, Dave, these restorations many times are unique to the people that perform them, depending upon where you received your training, what types of materials were used. And dentists can pick up on that very quickly. So this individual, whoever did this, had an understanding that teeth would kind of point in the direction of who this person was. And they're behind the eight ball also in the sense, and we're talking about the missing head. They didn't even have a skull to be able to go back and kind of strip it down and build it back out, even with clay modeling, which is something that's done to give you an idea of what this person may have looked like. And this is back then. You didn't have that to go, and so you're absent, and that would give us a visual identification, right? So we're missing teeth, we're missing that, and of course we get to the hands. Well, you don't have hands, and the reason someone might take the hands off of a body, obviously, is for the purposes of fingerprinting. And so whoever did this had an awareness of what the capabilities were of the authorities at that point in time. We've got to get rid of the head, because that can give us that can give them a visual ID, or that can give them a dental ID. And oh, by the way, we've got to take the hands, because if they print this person, they're going to know who it is. Maybe they've got a record, or maybe they can compare it with an antemortem print that they might lift at the house that actually has happened, where if a person didn't have prints on record and you suspected that it might be one particular, you go to their home or the suspected person's home, you lift a latent print and you compare what you have in the morgue to that, which has always been fascinating to me. They don't even have that, Dave. So you've got a perpetrator involved in this case that has that level of awareness. And I would say, in my estimation, that as dark as this is, it could get a lot darker, because whoever this perpetrator is, this wasn't their first time. Well, we've got a torso, Dave, that has been transected. And when I say transected, I want people to think about running, if you look at it from points on the compass, and you're talking about going from east to west or west to east across the body. Okay, so if you go from the right side of the body to the left side and you cut the body in half, that's a transection. Say that it's at the level of the what they refer to, what doctors refer to as the umbilicus, which is essentially the belly button. You cut across there, that's a transection. They found everything north of that, but later they were actually able to go back and find the lower torso with the legs. They found, in addition to that, they found the arms at some point in time, but the arms are absent the hands. And again, that's what you're looking at with this is a lot of tool marks on these surfaces as the body is actually being dismembered. That would give you an indication of what kind of instruments that were used. But look, if you got nothing to go on other than that, and you don't know who this person is, you're kind of walking around in the dark, man.
And you end up cold. This case, they worked hard. I went through all the different files we could find and what they did, they being the investigators at the time. And they were very impacted on a personal level with what they found. I'm sure they were disgusted by the total lack of respect for humankind that would allow
Yeah, and
somebody to do
this
this.
is not like something that happens every single day in this bedroom community to Chicago.
It's
You
not
think about Chicago,
right.
even back then, there's a certain level of violence associated, but out here, no.
And that's what kind of got me out of my element. I go back to the chief talking about when he found out. I was mowing my yard. After the call, complete chaos. But that chaos settled down when they couldn't find head, hands, and things like that. And eventually, after they did all the work they could on what was left of the torso, they were left without an identifiable body. They knew it was a homicide, and they were able to determine that the body was not killed where parts of it were found. I don't want to say it. Is that, I don't know a better way to say it.
No, you can just say you refer to the remains.
Okay, the remains.
That's literally all you have are remains. Right. You know that they're human.
Yeah.
And there's not, we're not dehumanizing what had occurred, but it's the fact that I think that it's very confusing for a lot of people. What type of handle do you hang on this to try to understand? Are we talking about? And they were initially a single piece of what turned out to be human tissue, a large piece. The upper torso, and then later, finding the lower torso with the legs. Is very important. But I think that just as important, again, going back to this idea that what's missing,
right? And that the part about this, Joe, that continues to strike me, because they were able to identify the body, but it took so long. The case went cold, and you have to remember, it's not just that they found the torso. Because that torso was not identified, there was a missing person. Somebody was looking for this individual who ended up as what was left of him, torso. And when I looked at how they took the investigation, they ran with it, they worked it hard, and ended up without being able to identify the body. But they came close. They got a lot of information. But still, years go by with no answer. And during those years, there was a family wanting to know what happened to their loved one. It wasn't just a lump. This was a human being that had family looking for him. So how did they actually end up being able to identify the torso that they found 44 years earlier?
Well, this is, when Cook County Medical Examiner's Office did their assessment of what they could at that particular time. Remember, when you're trying to approximate the stature of an individual, if all you're working from is just initially the upper torso, and then finally, they find the remaining lower torso. A stature, many times, a stature estimation, which is like a real kind of baseline that you're working from, if you're trying to get a physical description, is difficult, because you don't have all of the parts that should be there. So a height estimation, a weight estimation, all of those sorts of things are difficult to assess, because you're absent all of these other elements, and all of that plays into it. At the time when Cook County, did their assessment, they approximated that the individual was probably about 30 years of age, may have been around 5'8". So they had some baseline to work with. They knew that it wasn't going to be an older person, but unless you have something a bit more specific, and your hands are really tied in cases like this back then, you're left with a big fat goose egg. And it just so happens that they had retained samples of this individual. They were able to, I think that finally, the folks with Barrington Hill Police, after all these years, they thought, well, let's just take a gamble here. Let's throw caution to the wind. We don't have any answers. This case has been on the shelf for all these many years. let's see what we can do with the latest technology. And boy, they hit the jackpot. They were able to actually submit samples to Othram down in Texas, and Othram Labs took this, and boy, did they ever run with this thing, Dave. They conjured this fellow up scientifically from these remains that they had from all the way back in 1979.
Think about a cold case from 1979, Joe, and all these years later, technology has been developed to be able to identify who this individual is. It boggles my mind. And the fact they have to crowdfund is another show entirely. We'll get into that. So as they're breaking it down, Joe, to get to the person, how do they do that? How do they take the DNA, a droplet of blood or something, or the inside of a tooth? I mean, just something they can pull a DNA strand from and come up with a person. It doesn't work like that.
No, it doesn't. It's very, very, very difficult. And what they would be working with here, keep in mind you're going to be absent certain elements. And most of the time, they're going to go into, if they have teeth, they can certainly harvest, hopefully, some DNA that has some level of viability that will lead to success, or they go into bone and extricate it from there and begin to kind of build out the person, if you will. And there's a couple of ways that once they begin to patch all of this in and begin the sequencing, where they can come up with who they think this individual could be or might be from a perspective of racial characteristics, any kind of disease profile that the DNA might reveal. They can do phenotyping, which is quite amazing in and of itself, where you can build out an image of the individual based upon the data that's contained within the DNA. But in this particular case, Othram, who, I made mention in a previous episode of my visit out there, I was not just impressed by the fact that at Othram they have geneticists that are on board, genetic scientists that are there that do the examination, the DNA examination. But in addition to that, they have a whole staff of genealogists. And so once they're able to kind of pull that strand, or like I say, pull the thread, everything else becomes unraveled in a good way. It begins to point you in particular directions. And it's through the ability that the genealogist has, coupled with the efforts of the DNA scientist, you're going to begin to discover who's in this family tree. And once you have that bit of data, you can go back, and it might be a cousin, several times removed, but you've got a place to start. And that's how any good investigation works.
And it's funny because the investigation, Joe, the police investigation, after they get the science back, then they're working at we're talking dragnet, knocking on doors, checking trash and things like that. As you mentioned, it might be a cousin, second, something along there. The police were combined with the science is amazing to me. And this case really blows my mind when they come back to because the police had spent a lot of time on this. So giving them this one piece of tangible evidence of who we're looking at here, they were able to just build the human being that they found on August 5th, 1979.
Yeah. And isn't that something, when you begin to think about that, and you can have that data, you can go back and you can hopefully give the family some peace of mind. As I've said before, there's no such thing as closure. I will continue to say that. But you can give the family maybe some peace of mind relative to this. But also another big piece of this, Dave, is that once you establish the ID of a subject, that gives the police a starting point as well, because then you begin to, and this is the trouble with cold cases, you go back and you dig into this individual's life, and you begin to try to develop who he may have been associated with, who his, as we say down here in the South, who his running buddies may have been, anybody that he may have worked with, any peripherals. And that might point you to answers as to who may have in fact done this. But I have to say, after all these years, Othram, as a result of their efforts, were able to determine that the victim in this case was Joseph Caliva. He was 27 years old at the time of his murder. And finally, the family has answers. We can only hope that eventually they're going to have answers as to who committed this horrible crime. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.